Thank you all for attending. We're happy to see you here. The mission of the speaker series is to engage with leaders in the allied design professions. We are proud of our students, faculty, and facilities and wish to demonstrate our hospitality and gratitude to our esteemed guest speakers who have made time from their busy schedules to come speak with us. Please show this by listening quietly and remaining in your seats for the entirety of the presentation. These talks are recorded for both academic and public use and can be found online through the LAEP department website. If time permits, a Q&A will follow the presentation until the end of the hour, after which you may scan a QR code for attendance. At the conclusion of such, any are welcome to meet with the speaker and enjoy light refreshments in the LAEP Commons studio. Today, we're especially proud to welcome back one of our own, Cari Goetcheus, who earned her Bachelor's of Landscape Architecture here at USU. Cari is a historical landscape architect with over 30 years of experience in cultural heritage, specializing in cultural landscape research, documentation, and preservation planning. Her career has spanned both professional practice and public service, including work with the Architects Collaborative in Boston and the National Park Service in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and Anchorage. She has also played an influential role in heritage documentation, helping to establish the Historic American Landscape Survey, a national effort to record significant cultural landscapes. Currently, Cari is an associate professor at the University of Georgia, where she teaches in the College of Environment and Design and serves as the U.S. voting member for the International Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscapes. Her recent work explores the intersection of cultural heritage and climate change, and she is the co-editor of the 2023 volume of the Routledge Handbook of Cultural Landscape Practice. Today in her lecture, Cultural Landscape Thinking, Cari will invite us to explore how landscapes reflect culture, identity, and change, and why this way of thinking matters now more than ever. Please join me in welcoming Cari Goetcheus.
I actually feel very honored knowing it's a beautiful day outside today, guys. So thank you all very much for showing up. So I am going to start by giving you a little bit of an introduction to what is a cultural landscape. So from a geographer's perspective, it is basically any place that has been physically manipulated by humankind. So let's think about that. Any place, at any time. So it doesn't matter what peoples did this, have physically manipulated a place. So that's kind of everywhere in the world? Yeah, everything's a cultural landscape from a geographer's perspective. When the Park Service is looking at that, they add a couple of filter layers. One filter layer is what kind of historic significance does it represent? Art, architecture, engineering, culture. And then there's another layer of, is there enough physical evidence still on the site to relay that to the public, okay? So we're going to start with those definitions and a baseline. So some of these things you would say, yeah, of course. You know, we have nice gardens, we have parks, we have cemeteries, we have vernacular areas. Okay, maybe I can get a subdivision. How about a really interesting road through a national park? But you're telling me commercial development? Yeah. A landfill? Yeah. Technically, those are all cultural landscapes. We just have to decide what we value, what we think has historic significance, etc. So the other part with historic significance is there's kind of this unwritten rule that for the National Register of Historic Places, if something is 50 years old or older, it can be considered historic. So that means today, 50 years ago, if something was built or physically manipulated, a park was created, from that time on, it's considered historic. Tomorrow's a new day. So from that date, the next day. So literally this 50 years is a moving target as to what's historic, all right? But what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about cultural landscape thinking broadly. So I have to tell you a little bit about my journey so you can understand kind of how I came to be and came to be thinking about this. So,
Is your microphone?
I believe it is.
Okay.
Yep. I am from Connecticut. I am from New England, all right? So my town is this place called Tolland. or because it was on the old post road between Boston and Hartford, and we believe it was a toll road, it might have been toll land. But it had your kind of classic New England layout of on a green. So a large, wide green space where literally around the entire edge are the important buildings, not just houses, but school, jail, police building, museum, everything like that, church. And this is what I knew as I was growing up. Episcopalian, very kind of Puritan roots, but very classic wooden architecture, church steeples, two-story buildings. And this is literally what I saw even in the 1970s when I was growing up. And my landscape was kind of rolling hills, beautiful autumn vegetation, both natural and human-made landscape. So this is my beginning of trying to understand place and people and landscape, okay? Well, when I decided to go to college, I went to a 2-year ag and tech, and I learned about bugs and dirt and soil and design, but I didn't go too far away. I went to New York State, and it was pretty similar. You know, you still have the rolling hills in the background, large agricultural areas, and all right, if you got a couple thousand high, that was really high, right? Elevation hikes. So still pretty similar. But I finished up my first degree, and I realized that I actually liked design and landscape architecture, so I was going to go for more training. And at that point in time, I was kind of adventurous. I wanted to explore. I did not visit Utah State before I said, I'll adapt. Sure, I'll just come here and I'll figure it out. But when I got here, I was like, what planet have I landed on? What are these mountains? I don't understand it. It's beautiful. I could identify some of the vegetation, but not all the vegetation. And it was just very, very different physiographically, the water, right? The mountains were so steep, I'd never seen anything like this. And then also from my perspective, these were like barren. Like, if you go backwards, like this is what I knew, right? You didn't have in quotes these barren hillsides. So I'm seeing this, but then I always have to go to culture. What is the culture of that place? It's brand new to me. Let me try and figure this out. This is a great database out of Canada called Native Lands. And I like it because it does not have the US boundaries of states, but it literally will show you the diversity of Native American nations that existed throughout the United States and how much they overlapped to show that there were cultures here long before white people decided to settle here, okay? So I have that to try and understand when I'm beginning to be here. And then Mormon culture. Even aside from like the amazing planning and development of along the Great Salt Lake and the planning of the city, the grid area, but then like how large the basins were and how far that extended, right? And of course what the history is, but then realizing there's all these Native American tribes. There are influences from Mexico, influences from Spain, and then the diversity of European settlers that were here as well. So this whole milieu of what this place was totally different to what I understood. So this is kind of the beginning of me understanding cultural landscape thinking, that every place, basically a people will go there and say, essentially, what can I get from this place? Whether it's Native Americans that want to live there, whites that need to have mills that run off of water power, or whatever it might be. What can I get from those natural resources? So I want to understand who these occupants are so I can understand how they're taking advantage of the natural resources. So they're manipulating it for what they need at any point in time. So I wanted to go through my photo albums and say, yes, I was a student once. So there's my student ID proof. There's my friends that were in the landscape architecture program. I went to places like Zion National Park, went to places like Filoli Gardens in California on field trips, and just got to see a lot of different things. So again, I was adding more and more to all these different cultures, all these different design things. What are these things? If any of you know the Insights Journal from Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning, I was one of the students that helped start that program, and so this is literally the first edition of Insights newsletter that we did, which I'm actually quite proud to show you because I don't know if there's much of an archive for these old newsletters. So after I finished at my university days here, I was hired in Boston, Massachusetts, so kind of back to my homeland, to do landscape architecture practice. And I was very fortunate to be hired by a firm called the Architects Collaborative. This was a very well-known firm at the time. Basically, it was started by a group of architects that were pretty much bringing modernism from Europe to the United States, the Bauhaus movement of architecture. Several of them taught at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And they were to me, it was a really great experience as a landscape architect because this was a multidisciplinary firm. And to be in a multidisciplinary firm where I could learn from architects, from interior designers, from construction managers about like where landscape architecture fit in there or didn't fit in there was really, really helpful for me as a professional to kind of grow and understand things. But then it's also just, again, the place, the culture. Even though I grew up in New England, I only went to see the Sox games, pretty much. Celtics every once in a while, but mostly the Red Sox games. So we would go into Boston, but we're looking at things that literally dealt with the revolution of our country, the beginning of our country, and understanding that history from Paul Revere's house to Faneuil Hall to Independence Hall and the Marketplace, and then of course the Boston Public Garden, which of course the Commons we learn about in our landscape history classes. So again, I'm learning about how design and culture are influencing the way we design and use place in very different ways in very different geographic regions. But when I decided to continue on with my training, I decided to put together landscape architecture and historic preservation. I had come from a very historic area. I had no idea if the two of them were actually going to be together. Would they work? But then I thought, well, I want to go to a school that doesn't discount my landscape architecture training, but actually will add to it. So when I went to the University of Georgia and got my Master's of Historic Preservation, I learned that and the whole reason I went there was because there were some nationally and internationally known professors who could teach about cultural landscapes and historic landscapes. And that's who these four people are here. And the kinds of things that they were teaching about were everything from African American landscapes and gardens and ethnic traditions in cultural landscape research. Alan Stovall was a local guy, and he came from a very rural, mountainous area of Georgia, and he really pushed a lot on what rural cultural landscapes were and how to nominate these things to the National Register of Historic Places. He was a practicing landscape architect and really did a lot for the field to identify and nominate the kind of ordinary places of our past. Ian Firth, both Richard and Ian were British, and he really focused on being able to work with the National Park Service about what cultural landscapes were and how they should be managed and treated. And then Catherine Howitt was very much into the theory and practice of cultural landscapes. So I really was able to learn quite a bit. So I had talked a little earlier about how some of the filters we use on cultural landscapes is historic significance, and then is there enough evidence, physical evidence? So authenticity or integrity and significance are important parts, as well as the 50-year rule. Those are the kinds of things that I learned about what the National Register of Historic Places is while I was at the University of Georgia. And one of the things you have to learn about the National Register of Historic Places is it really is supposed to represent everything about America, not just the really highly designed or really shiny or only the wealthy or only the white. Absolutely not. This is meant to represent the United States. So it is vernacular farmsteads. It is ranch houses. It is, believe it or not, the very first Walmart is nominated to the National Register. There are things right now, I'm going to guess at some point in time, the very first In-N-Out is going to be on the National Register. I have no doubt of that, because this is what humanity wanted, American society wanted. We have a lot of them. There's a design pattern related to it, but how do we tell whether it's significant and has value or not? So we will look at all of these things as we move along. So when I went to Georgia, of course I'm looking at the southern United States, another area. You can see I like to move around a lot. So I wanted to show you this image because they're saying in this particular image that the states that are the darkest color are usually typically called the South. Sometimes those medium red ones, I guess they decide whether they want to be called the South or not. And then the striped ones, I would say other people say they are or aren't, although I think Florida ought to be striped because it just depends. There's so many migrants that come from other places there, from the north. But the thing I want to point out is this little map up here. Anyone ever heard of the Mason-Dixon line? And all the stories about like, oh, that's where the free states are, that's where the slave states are. So if that is Maryland and West Virginia right there, so that's considered the South, you got some stripes. I wouldn't want to really ask someone from West Virginia or Maryland if they consider themselves Southern or not. They will absolutely say that they are Southern, okay? So these kinds of things have changed over time. And so when I think South, I think food, barbecue, different kinds of sweet tea for sure. But I think it's really important to look at all the places that I've been through, the different kinds of what I'll call racial diversity. And in this case, all they're saying in this graphic is that if you were to ask two people randomly, they probably would be from different ethnic groups. And so then how much is lesser diverse based on that standard versus more? So Hawaii has a 76% chance, very, very diverse, that more than one person asked is going to be from different ethnic groups. If we look at Maine, nope, that's pretty low on the scale of not a lot of diversity there. Upstate New York, 65.8% there. West Virginia, 20%. Utah, 40%. Georgia, 64%. There's a lot more cultures that have come in over time, layering, that then have manipulated the land the way that they care to. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that cultural landscape. I want to tell you a little bit about one kind of cultural landscape and cultural group in the South that I've been working with, the Gullah Geechee. These basically are people who were brought over from Africa, 1700s on, through the slave trade routes. And they literally were from different nations, and in some cases they were chosen to be taken because they already understood how to deal with rice crops and different kinds of agriculture that they knew in the humid South would have to be worked on. But it also was purposeful, not a large concentration of anyone who had a language majority. So the more you have language minorities that they can't really talk to one another, the more you can control people, okay? So essentially they had to come up with another language that crossed all those languages so they could communicate. So Gullah and Geechee is kind of considered that way of communicating. So you can imagine food recipes and ways of doing things are mixing, the way that you build architecture is mixing, the way that you physically change the land, do agriculture, they're all mixing. One of the things that has been continues is basically something called sweetgrass baskets. And there are certain ecological zones in the coastal Carolinas that allows a different variety of grasses, sweetgrass, bulrush, palmetto fronds, and pine needle to be used to create these baskets. And they literally call this sewing baskets. And there are all these very local basket stands up and down numerous roads in different parts of this 30-mile band from North Carolina to the northern portion of Florida. This is considered the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, okay? So you will find a very interesting and different culture in that part of the South. As part of our study, we were looking right outside of Charleston, and we looked at about a dozen different black communities, and we literally asked them, historically, what would you say the boundaries of your community are? And then currently, what would you consider the boundaries? And this was probably about a 100-year difference when we were asking this. So I'll just show you on this blue one here. Historically, the community felt that lighter shade of blue was the boundary of their community. Because of the pressure for development that occurred and how fast development occurred, and I'm talking about like modern contemporary development, they now consider this much smaller area to be their community. And you can kind of tell by land use patterns on the outsides, it's kind of traditional suburban design, right? So this is happening also in other areas with the kind of greenish yellow there area. And in some areas where there used to be very strong black neighborhoods, these neighborhoods have been totally gentrified and development is just basically pushing everybody out. So this was some of the studies that we were doing to try and help the planning community in the Charleston area think about how can they help keep those communities alive, essentially. And we went a little bit bigger, a little hard to see here, sorry, but we looked at ecosystems on the right-hand side, and then kind of the culture and how much it was developing. So the orange line is the urban growth boundary for the city of Charleston. And the peninsula itself, where it first started, is this darkest gray. And this kind of, as it's going lighter and lighter, just know like this is 1850 concentration here, then kind of like a ring of by 1900, that's where development was, further out by 1950 done. And then they're saying that like all these kind of pinkish areas here is going to be where development is in about 2030, all right? And the biggest thing I want you to see is like how basically this is an incredibly fragile wetlands area, and you can kind of see the images here. So as development is occurring, it's really impacting the ecology, the water table, I mean everything. There's a lot of salt water that's coming into the water table, so when you pump up, you're getting salt out of your tap. You don't want that kind of thing, okay? So we were looking to see, like, by 2030, about 20% of the ecosystem is absolutely going to be destroyed because of this kind of development that we're doing that you can see here in Cache Valley. We also looked culturally, and all these red dots were taken from historic maps about where Black and or Gullah Geechee communities historically had been located in the 1920s to about the 1960s. So what they're saying is that where all that development is, 95% of Gullah Geechee communities that were thriving Black communities are going to be physically impacted and probably not there any longer by 2030, just because of the way that we develop today. So being cognizant of these things as you design, as you do analysis, as you plan, as we talk about gentrification and affordable housing and everything else, you have to really understand a place to be able to plan and design for a place for all the people. I had an opportunity to work for the National Park Service for quite some time, about 7 or 10 years. And I had the opportunity to live and work in Atlanta, so I was working with all the Southeast regional parks at that point in time. I went to DC, so pretty much the nation was my office. And for a short time, I went to Anchorage, Alaska. And so I had the opportunity to work on all kinds of cultural landscape things, and I'll get into a little detail in a moment. But we went to, some of you recognize this, Glacier National Park. There used to be a requirement that everyone went on the big red bus. Can you imagine that would be such a cool way to go through the park today? Awesome. Went to Daiya, a town site, a historic town site of the Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska. Worked on that for a little while. Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. And then lots and lots of different education and workshops is what we were doing. So from the National Park Service, I want to talk a little bit about the way we understand cultural landscapes. So if I am looking at a historic place in one of the parks, and I want to understand its cultural landscape in a very general way, I'm going to do background research on the environment. I'm going to do historic research, what might have happened there. I'm going to see what's there today. I'm going to go out in the field. I'm going to inventory what's still there. And then I'm probably going to analyze and compare what's here today to what used to be, because that will help identify, are there things that I want to protect? And when I say landscapes, that includes buildings, that includes archaeology, that includes any kind of ethnographic reference, ruins, but it also includes the ecosystem, right? Whether it's been physically manipulated or it's had trees grow where fields were before, or different things have happened. So I'm literally looking at the eras of occupation over a very long time period. Okay? So as I'm looking at every single one of those periods, I'm literally deconstructing my understanding of that landscape. So for the folks that I was in the site analysis class this afternoon, this is what I mean by I made my career out of analysis. So I literally look first at just what's the natural systems and features? Why did people want to come here and use this place to begin with? All right. Then I'm going to look at spatial organization. Once they got there, how did they organize where their farms were located, where their roads were located, where their fields were located? And usually there's a lot of just general functional logic to that. I would look and see what did they choose, how they used land. This is where the cultural traditions is about those layering of occupations, so you can understand a place. Sometimes they would cluster where activities or buildings or land uses were, so I would look at that for a little while. I would look at circulation, and by that I mean pedestrian circulation as well as vehicular circulation, how the two interacted or how they really worked as separate systems. Topography is definitely different than natural systems and features. These are much smaller scale, and it's kind of like human-created topography, all right? Vegetation, I would look at what the natural vegetation was, but then I would look at what was purposely planted. That could be trees, that could be shrubs, that could be heirloom bulbs, whatever. I would look at different buildings, and I don't care if this was an outhouse, or if this was a barn, or this was a very high-style mansion. I was going to look at all of it to understand how and why it came about, all right? Looking at views and vistas. So sometimes we're very purposeful about, we want you to stand here and look that way. I want to know, was that designed? Was that purposeful? Or did it just kind of happen as I was walking along and, oh, look at these great views I can see out there, okay? Sometimes we look at constructed water features. In this landscape here, where we have a lot of human-made lakes, you want to look at all those dams and then the impact of the shape of those lakes and what might have been at the bottom of the creeks to begin with. Small-scale features is everything from lights, fence, garbage bins, and kind of truly small things that all kind of add to the character of a place, all right? And then archaeological sites. So there's a very specific way that the Park Service says we need to look at all these different historic or cultural landscapes to try and understand them for every single era of occupation. So yeah, that can take a while, but you really understand a place before you even go to design something new or protect something. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some projects that I had an opportunity to work on. One is for Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Historical Park. I have to tell you, you don't really go to the Park Service and say full names. They have this entire, I call it code. So what they do is they take, if it's a two-word name of a park, they will take the first two letters of each of the words and they will smash them together. And so that is known as chit-chat. So when we're in meetings, we're not saying at the Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park, we're saying chit-chat, we did this, 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 or at chat, or at oak, or whatever. So it makes it, so for you, you just have the inside scoop. I'm talking about chit-chat for the next minute or so. So one of the things we were trying to do was try and figure out the road system that's in the park right now, does it reflect truly what was happening on the day of the battle, the Civil War battle? And so we had access to maps, sketches, and narratives that showed on the days of the battle what buildings were there, what owners owned properties, what fords across the rivers there were, if there were mills. So we had this list. We looked at that. Then after the battle, we were also looking at other blueprints when, after the battle, this is good agricultural fields, you pick up the bodies, you bury the bodies, you move them off the agricultural lands, and you continue to farm and have orchards and live your lives. So they had all different kinds of maps that showed where orchards were, where open spaces were, where the buildings were, et cetera, where the forest was. And then we even went into the early 1900s when a military installation was put here for the Spanish-American War, and we saw roadways as well. What we came to find out is that, yes, actually, as we're interpreting these things to the public, the alignment and location of the roads are nearly exactly the same as they were back in 1863, 1865, which is a pretty cool thing to be able to say. Public, you can trust us because we've done our homework. We actually have all the same roads that we had previously. Another example is an example of landscape archaeology and how helpful that can be. So this deals with Thomas Jefferson, and hopefully you all know about Monticello and what a wonderful place that is. Well, I guess sometimes you get tired of a wonderful place and you need to have a retreat from your wonderful place. So you have another wonderful place. This one happens to be called Poplar Forest. It's probably about an hour and a half, 2 hours from Monticello. And there wasn't a lot left above ground of what this historic landscape looked like. So they had to do archaeology. So when they did that, they basically did some digging and ground penetrating radar, and they found an early version of kind of like an irrigation ditch, which had stone in it, which would allow the water to kind of move along. And I'm hoping you can see this little kind of round circle here, and maybe one up there. The cool thing about landscape archaeology and archaeology in general is they do it in such small lifts so they don't hurt anything. They take just a little bit of soil off, and so they can tell just by the color of the soil, the texture of the soil, if this soil was always here or if it was moved from someplace. So the really cool thing about this is, aside from irrigation and seeing where the planting holes were for trees, is that they were able to look at pollen and phytoliths, very, very small seeds, that allowed them to figure out that the soil inside here, which came off of the planted tree, was different than here. And then they were able to actually find the original plant nursery down along the riverside, because that soil and a bunch of trees that never were transplanted were still down there. So I think it's pretty amazing. So I was talking a little earlier about how there has to be enough evidence still in place to say that something is authentic as part of the National Register. Excuse me. So at Chit Chat, again, we were looking at the roads still, but we were looking at all different components of the roads. And we wanted to know how intact and how authentic the roads were on the smaller scale. And so we ended up looking at these 1890s War Department photographs that showed when they first installed this road. And they put gravel or chert here for the actual road base. And then they put these really nice stone ditches for where the water was going to flow. So when you looked back when I was there in 1996, you could still see these stone ditches. So on first level, you might say, all right, well, the stone ditch is there, but you know what? They paved asphalt over it. Underneath there is still gravel. It is still chert. But probably more importantly, since there were these stone ditches on both sides of the road, that means that the road has not been physically widened since that time. So yes, there is enough evidence that it still is there to relay to the public that yes, this is a historic thing. All right, place you might be familiar with. When we talk about authenticity, integrity too, we can also look just at ecosystems, vegetation systems, okay? So here, if we look at, and use Half Dome as a reference, the valley floor. We have talus slopes that vegetations have begun to grow on, but we have a lot of open spaces, and we actually have roads that go through. This is how it was at this point in time. If you are saying that something is or isn't authentic, a lot of times you say, does it look exactly as it did? Really hard to control ecosystems from changing, all right? But from a perspective in preservation, vegetation is just a material that can be added or removed. So there's been a lot of battlefield restoration that might have been fields that grew up as forests because they weren't continued to be tended, that when they reconstruct them, they actually have to remove the forest to actually show how the battle occurred and why the battle occurred the way it did strategically, militarily, right? So in this one, you will see Half Dome here, right? A lot more vegetation on the floor, a little few open spaces here and there. But if we really wanted to, we could bring it back to this kind of openness. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency and a few other places might say, let's think about this a little bit, things have changed. But technically, you could say, has it lost authenticity or integrity because it doesn't have all those open spaces? I don't think so. And you can tell the public about how that changes and how ecosystems are hard to change and maintain. So one of the things we learned in the National Park Service was about not just the process and methodology of doing cultural landscape work, but also how to do a proper, what they call cultural landscape inventory, how to do that research, and then this thing called a cultural landscape treatment, or cultural landscape report that is the main treatment guidelines for the cultural landscape. So it's about long-term management in the Park Service. So basically all that information about environmental systems, historic research, inventorying what existing conditions still exist, it's all put into this. And then normally, if you have a particular project, if you need to put in a new parking lot, if you need to put in new kiosks or a new snack store, you want to make sure you're putting it in the right place. If you know all this information about a cultural landscape, you'll know where not to put it. Okay, so you're not putting it on something important. So I'm going to tell you kind of a couple of examples, one kind of a larger scale design treatment and one a much smaller scale. This is Philadelphia. And at one point in time, the city hall down here there was a grand boulevard put in to connect the brand new Museum of Art, okay? And so to do that, they hired a French urban planner named Jacques Robert, and in 1917 he did this bold plan of across this gridded city, he was going to do this radial line from the city hall, have a couple of nodes along it, and he wanted to put 3 rows of trees, so you have this very thick allée on both sides, so you know it's this grand ceremonial thing, all right? So by the time we get to 1950, you can see it's starting to fail. It's not as thick over here as it is over here. And this is just a tree living in a city. Certain trees can do better than other trees to live in a city. In this particular case, because we have winter, we have salt, we have erosion, we have compaction, certain trees are going to do better than other trees with that. So these trees were not doing very well. So luckily, it was owned by the Park Commission, so they could actually take action. It had taken about 5 or 8 years to construct originally, and you can see from the upper picture, these trees were not looking good. The problem was a couple things. 1, compacted soil. 2, that they were all the same exact species of tree. And so when a disease went through and it basically passed from roots to roots to roots, it just took out the whole thing. So they wanted to do something. And they ended up actually putting in different kinds of plants to make sure that that was interrupted if anything like that happened again, okay? But do you think that they were able to, the Park Commission just kind of went out one day and cut down 2 miles of trees without talking to anybody? Do you think the city people would appreciate that? No, they had to have a lot of public participation and education about what could or couldn't happen. And even with that, not everybody listens, not everyone pays attention, and there was definitely a little outrage about it. But the great thing is, they could show through graphics like this of when it was first planted, the kind of high life of a tree, 40, 50 to 80 years, what's happening there, what had been happening, how they want to really mimic this again. So the public reach was really, really important to make sure that everyone understood the why of it. And now people don't even notice because it's been there for so long now. A very small scale cultural landscape design solution is landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, very important in the history. His home was also his office. And I always say this is the perfect landscape architect's house because you can't see it. It's got vegetation everywhere. It's fantastic. But on the historic preservation side of things, this is awful because you can't paint, you can't conserve, you don't want the vines getting up underneath the clapboards, you know, you want to take care of the building. So how can you have this marriage of giving a little bit of a feel of this, but being able to protect what's going on with the building and stuff like that? So they essentially created these wire metal trellises that are on hinges. So around essentially 2 blocks of windows, top and bottom, they've created these hinges where they will have the vine growing up out of the ground, and they will train it to go up and around with a little extra space so that they can have the hinges here. They can have this come away from the building, clip, 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 clean, 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 and then be able to put the trellis back where it is. Is it exactly like that one? No, it's not. But will it give a hint and an idea of that? Absolutely. So it's about creativity, really. And you're only limited by that. Some of the things we were doing with the Park Service was about cultural landscape interpretation. And this really is where this cultural landscape thinking was coming in of, you have all these cultures, so there's going to be multiple points of view. Absolutely. And it makes it really complex. And you've got to have public participation through all of this. But the great thing is it encourages thoughts and communication and dialogue. And what is the real story of this place? So an example I wanted to show you is at Cane River Creole National Historical Park that's in Louisiana. And it has 67 historic structures and a variety of cultural landscapes in this area. It was an area that was in the Louisiana Purchase. So historically, there was native occupation. there was Spanish occupation, there was French occupation, and then there was English/American occupation. So all these different cultures doing different things physically, making different structures, it's this great basket of really interesting resources, okay? So there's two plantations, two very large plantations. One's called Oakland, one's called Magnolia. So one family happened to have owned one of these plantations for 10 generations. How long is a generation?
25.
About 25 years, yeah. So the 50-year rule that I talked about before, it has to do with perspective. That if you can get 2 generations away from when something was built, we might be able to think about it a little bit more objectively. If it's only 25 years away, it's still very fresh and familiar to me, so that can't possibly be historic. Of course, now that I'm over 50, I'm kind of like, 50? That's just a guidance. That's not old. Anyway, what I'm getting to is, you look at this and you're kind of like, okay, Goetcheus, why are you having us look at weeds? Yeah, this is a garden. These are bottles. And do you guys know what a bottle garden is? You basically take bottles, and when they're done, you're not going to throw them away, you're going to reuse them as edging. You turn them upside down and you put them in the ground, the throat down. So this family is there for 10 generations. They are wealthy enough from their plantations to be able to buy cases of scotch from Scotland, cases of scotch from Ireland, fine wines from France, and you have that archival history lining your garden bed. So how do you actually conserve this? It's absolutely a cultural landscape. You absolutely don't want to have these things stolen. But if you take these things out and say, let's put them in a museum, let's look at them, then they don't have their context by which they were used. So just now today, the Park Service has cleaned this all up, and they had to have a lot of different solutions of like, okay, well, the bottles are really important. Maybe we somehow tie them all together and we put them back in the ground, but then if someone wants to take it and pull one, do they all break? So they actually opted to not put them in a museum, not connect them, but leave them that way so they can tell these kinds of narrative stories of the cultural landscape. So it literally tells the story of 10 generations. All right. So another thing I learned about was the national heritage areas. I don't know if you guys know about these, but this is basically where preservation meets economic development. So I'm showing you this one in South Carolina because it was one that I happen to work on. But essentially the idea is physiographically, this is kind of ocean and flat sandy land up to about there, rolling hills that then finally gets into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains here. Architecture is very different all the way along here. This is, as you saw with Georgia, South Carolina is just about as racially diverse. So the occupation of Native Americans and peoples is really interesting. I was doing this work in the 2000s. When I looked the other day, it's fascinating to me that this was our original proposal of what this heritage corridor was going to be. They've actually said that that is so popular that we're actually going to turn it and expand it. So it's basically a third of the state now. They can use this for heritage tourism, and they can say, these vernacular landscapes are very different than the urban landscapes. These small towns and the economies, what they're trying to do is heritage tourism and get economic development into these small towns. So each of these communities has a different story to tell, and heritage areas is the way. When you look at heritage areas, you can go on the National Park Service website, look up national heritage areas, and there are basically over 100 now across the entire country. And they all have stories to tell. The other thing that I want to talk about is a program in the Park Service that I think is really important because it has to do with how we document our heritage. What's here and then what gets torn down. And as you guys have even seen in your own lifetimes, teardowns can happen pretty quick of these things that you thought were always going to be there, or farmland that you thought was always going to be there can very easily be turned into commercial development and housing, and you don't have those open spaces anymore, right? So HABS, HARE, and HALS, the Historic American Building Survey, HARE, the Historic American Engineering Record, and HALS, the Historic American Landscape Survey, are all programs that were established pretty much over the 1900s, and I'll talk a little bit about them. So the intent really is to create and then create an archive of these historic resources. And they're supposed to represent, like the National Register of Historic Places, but in documentation form, the history of our country, architecture, engineering, culture in general. And they're basically stored at the Library of Congress. You can look online right now and download all of this stuff for free. And there are amazing drawings, amazing old photographs. And the idea is to maintain this archive for future generations. Because if we lose these things, will people even know that they existed? So these are meant to be an archival source. And then the really cool thing is we're trying to educate next generations of architects, landscape architects, and engineers. So you can actually get an internship with these guys today, learning how to do this kind of stuff. And it's a paid internship, usually at a really cool national park. So HABS was created by this gentleman, Charles Peterson, and this was happening during the Depression. During the Depression, the federal government was frantic, trying to figure out ways to put people back to work. And so they basically said to all branches of the government, if you can come up with valid programs that can get people back to work that are worthy of creating whatever you're suggesting they're creating, we'll listen. So this was one of those programs. There were thousands of architects out of work. And basically they thought, you know what? What would happen if Independence Hall fell down? What about the Statue of Liberty? What if that went away? Would we understand our history if these things, we don't have some kind of documentation of them? So the idea was to not only train architects how to do this properly, but then create a record of this, okay? So the historic, HABS was created as part of legislation in Historic Sites Act in 1935. Hair, there seems to be a 30-year gestation period for these. So it took about 30 years. In 1969, basically the engineers said, hey, we have a lot of historic engineering innovations, really interesting technology, from massive water systems to mining systems to canal systems, and we need to document all this really interesting, innovative technology over the years. So they did the same exact thing. And they basically house it at the Library of Congress. HABS has an association with the American Institute of Architects. The engineers have about 4 or 5 different engineering societies that they are related to. And then about 30 years later, I had the honor of helping to create this program, the Historic American Landscape Survey, which was created on the centennial of the American Society of Landscape Architects' creation. And so similarly, ASLA is the associated professional program that has dealing with this. Now the cool thing about this is this actually started back in 1936. So for a short time period, there was a pilot project called the Historic American Landscape and Gardens Project. It was happening directly after the Historic American Building Survey. Unfortunately, it didn't continue, so we had to reinvent it again in the year 2000. And as we were doing this, you know, one of the things about the HABS Hair Hal collection is there's a lot of consistency in format. You always do black and white photography. How does that work for landscape? When I say green, which green do you mean? Right? And then even with landscape, it's about moving through place, so there's different perspectives. You can't just have one picture wrap up an entire landscape. So we had to say we need video, all right? But we also were sticking with the typical by having drawings and trying to show different seasons, what was going on. So we would do high-style, fancy gardens, but then we were also trying to do woodland gardens, which had been designed and planted at earlier times at certain parks. But then it's also about forest ecology. How do you capture that in a picture? You actually have to have schematics and process and methodology drawings to talk about this kind of thing, all right? So we were really pushing the limits of maybe that way of documenting buildings has worked for 70 years. Maybe that way of documenting engineering has worked, but it doesn't work for landscape. We need to move and change things a little bit with that, okay? So that format is essentially this narrative format. You do historic research, you write it up. You always have black and white photographs, and you typically do some kind of lovely line drawing that is not two-dimensional, but tries to be three-dimensional. As you can imagine, it really focuses on new technologies, so they always seem to have the funds to be able to push the technologies. And so LiDAR, 3D scanning, always looking at that kind of stuff. Taking those point clouds from a photo and transferring them into a line drawing through CAD. But one thing we're finding is that, of course, technology is always really hip, cool, and groovy until it doesn't work, or only partially works. So you just have to be honest about what it can and cannot do. It is just a tool. So have any of you ever felt like that? I know I have, absolutely. And when you are in charge or trying to help scan the Statue of Liberty, and you realize they've just spent days, a lot of money to do three-dimensional scanning around this thing, and you weren't really thinking about the fabric folds and that you weren't going to capture everything. Historically, we would have put a scaffolding up there and we would have done hand measurements. Obviously, the 3D measurements is helping, scanning a lot, but actually you have to do a combination of those things to understand. The historic documentation programs, we actually do ships, whether they are wrecks in the bottom of the river or they are above ground. So we still do hand measurements. So we have to have that combination. So this idea of the value of traditional documentation is really, really important, knowing how to do it and how to do it in a pinch, just in case. Then I had an opportunity to work at 2 different universities, Clemson for a while. I seem to pick all these big football schools, I don't know. Anyway, did landscape architecture there, had an opportunity to teach a little bit of preservation, and then since I've been at the University of Georgia, I've really been totally immersed in cultural landscapes. So we have quite a few courses in the historic preservation program that are cultural landscape focused. We have certificates for both the grad and undergrad program in cultural landscapes. And I also manage something called the Cultural Landscape Lab, which gives students an opportunity to work on National Park Service projects, doing those inventories and research that I was talking about. So just to kind of recap, cultural landscapes are basically nature and culture in the same exact place. And it could be a lot of different kinds of nature, always a lot of different things of culture. And it's really hard to kind of sometimes suss that out. But internationally, they've been using the term nature culture or culture nature with no space between those two because they are in the same place. It just kind of depends if you're more of a cultural resource organization, you're going to put culture, the word culture first. If you're more a natural organization, you're going to put the word nature first. But essentially, it's this environment first with all these cultural systems on it afterwards. But I really want to talk about this in kind of concluding here, that every place that we are and go, there's absolutely natural habitats, but there's also those human-shaped habitats, right? There's the tangible heritage, the physical evidence, and then the intangible is things like religion, song, foodways, language, dance, furnishings, textiles, okay? So things that kind of make up the culture. So we have this biological diversity and cultural diversity, and it is all in one place. So this whole idea of cultural landscape thinking is just acknowledging that this stuff is all in one place. And it's all over the world. I've just given you a few examples of places here in the United States. Just imagine how wonderfully complex these cultural landscapes are all over the world, okay? So just to give you an idea, I actually teach a class where we go to Croatia every year. And I literally call it my nature culture class. And if you look at this landscape, it may feel a little familiar. It actually does have some familiar plant materials. But I can tell you that the architecture is very different, made from very different materials, because the religion over the decades and centuries is very different. Who has occupied that territory over the years has influenced the architecture, the building materials, the way we've manipulated the landscape, okay? So you can do this everywhere in the world, and I do. I've had the opportunity to look at a lot of, and interact with a lot of international groups about what cultural landscape is, and this is not a new thing. This has been going on since the 80s, and it's just getting stronger. In fact, we've been told by landscape architecture private firms that they are desperate for people who have this kind of knowledge. So it is definitely a marketing skill that you should think about for when you're going out in the world. So to kind of conclude, We've always talked in the more recent age of the pillars of sustainability being environment, economic, social. I'm hoping today that I was able to show you also that it's about culture as absolutely one of the foundations of moving sustainability into the future. There's been things written about this, about how cultural heritage has to be involved in climate change, in heritage as we change, and in the environmental conversations. If planting zones have been shifting over the years, and this is actually somewhat old data, how does that affect both what we can plant now with new designs, but if we're actually trying to interpret old designs and the original plant materials aren't able to live there anymore, how do we keep that authenticity? How do we keep the design intent? Luckily, the Park Service has some ideas, and they've been thinking about this since 2017, about how climate change can be addressed through cultural landscapes. And they have basically what they consider a whole bunch of black and white options. You can actually do absolutely nothing, and just let climate change take it, right? You can try and de-stress the property. You maybe can help improve resilience through a variety of activities. Maybe interpret the change to the public. Maybe you document it and you say, now that we have it documented, I can't do anything about it, so I'll let it go. For buildings, they will say, maybe you relocate it. You can't relocate a cultural landscape. You can relocate elements of it, the buildings. Not going to really relocate the archaeology. Right? So this brings me back to Utah. The spiral jetty. Hopefully kind of a show of hands of people who know what that is. Okay, so you've heard of it. Good. So when there was water, the intent was that the temperature of the water would change, and so there would be different algae, et cetera, that would grow. Today, because of how the lake is receding, it is different. But I wasn't sure if you knew that the spiral jetty was actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places in December of 2024. So I wanted to read to you the why of it. Robert Smithson's spiral jetty at the Great Salt Lake is an internationally celebrated work of land art. The site is of national significance under criterion C in the area of art as the work of a master. Smithson is considered one of the most influential post-war artists in America. According to scholar Dr. Johanna Drucker, the work of Robert Smithson occupies a crucial historical and conceptual position in 20th century art, participating in the shift from the modernist autonomy to minimalist theatricality. Smithson's sculpture emphasizes the historical break with the aesthetic field of modernity. Spiral jetty is also nationally significant under criterion C in the area of landscape architecture. Through his large-scale earthworks like spiral jetty, Smithson reframed how landscape architects considered the built environment, directly influencing the field of landscape architecture. Finally, spiral jetty is also significant under criterion C in the area of art, as an influential example of land art, a modern genre of art which emerged from the unique political and social environment of the 19th century America. Instantly celebrated by the art world when constructed, today the spiral jetty is widely recognized as the best known Roberts. Search the region. Released lake bed at Roselle Point in the March of 1970. He constructed it in the course of approximately 2 weeks in April of 1970. So the period of significance is 1970. Public appreciation for the spiral jetty continues to grow. In 2017, the Utah legislature voted to formally recognize it as an official symbol of the state by designating it as the state work of land art. So sometimes you don't even realize that you have these very important, very significant historic places, cultural places that are physical manipulations by humankind at any point in time in your backyard. So if anyone is interested in learning more just generally about cultural landscapes, these are some of the organizations and websites that you can go to. Feel free to take a photo. National Park Service has some great Cultural Landscape 101. There's a terrific nonprofit foundation called the Cultural Landscape Foundation that's done a lot of work for cultural landscape education. The Alliance for Historic Landscape Preservation is a great professionals organization. And then there's 2 international organizations, World Heritage USA and ICOMOS, the International Committee of Monuments and Sites, the International Scientific Committee of Cultural Landscapes, which I am the U.S. voting member for. So on that note, I will show you the book that got published a couple years ago, give you my contact information, and I think we're right at 5 o'clock, so I don't know if we have any time for questions and answers, or we need to run to the reception.
No, we don't need to run, but if you do have questions, go ahead and follow us up to the... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I will be very fast.
It's fine.
So, we just want, as at the end of this lecture, we just want to express our appreciation. We are recognizing Cari Goetcheus as a distinguished alumnus of the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. We are grateful for the impact that you have had and for how well you have represented both landscape architecture and the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.